Critique of the Idealistic Superstructure. Marx's critique takes a clear step beyond all previous critiques. It aims at an integral critique of heads. It insists on putting the heads back on the whole of living and labouring bodies. That is the meaning of the dialectic of theory and praxis. Brain and hand, head and belly. Marx's critique is guided by a realistic perspective on the social labour processes. What goes on in the heads of people, it says, remains, in the last instance, determined by the social function of the heads in the economy of social labour as a whole. For that reason, socio-economic critique has little respect for what consciousnesses say about themselves. Its motive is always to find out what the case is, objectively. Thus it asks each consciousness what it knows of its own position in the structure of labour and domination. And because, in doing so, it usually meets with a tremendous amount of ignorance, it gains here its point of attack. Because social labour is subject to a class structure, Marx's critique examines each consciousness in terms of what it achieves as class consciousness, and what it itself knows about this achievement. In the system of bourgeois society, three objective class consciousnesses can be distinguished initially: that of the bourgeois capitalist class, that of the proletariat producer class, and that of the intermediate functionaries, the middle class, with which the consciousness of the superstructure labourers, a group of scientists, judges, priests, artists and philosophers, with an indistinct class profile, mixes ambiguously. With regard to the traditional intellectual labourers, it becomes immediately apparent that they usually view their activities in a completely different way than they should, according to Marx's model. Intellectual labourers usually know next to nothing about their role in the economy of social labour and domination. They remain far removed from the ground of hard facts, live with their heads in the clouds, and view the sphere of real production from an unreal distance. They exist thus, according to Marx, in a world of global idealistic mystification. Intellectual labour, even the designation is an attack, wants to forget that it is also, in a specific sense, labour. It has got used to not asking about its interplay with material, manual and executive labour. The entire classical tradition, from Plato to Kant, thus neglects the social base of theory: slave economy, serfdom, relations of subjugation and labour. Instead, this tradition bases itself on autonomous intellectual experiences that motivate its activity: the striving for truth, virtuous consciousness, divine calling, absolutism of reason, genius. Against this it must be asserted that labour is an elementary relation of life, which a theory of the real has to take into account. Wherever it shows itself unwilling to do so, it wants to transcend these foundations. An unmasking is called for. This unmasking is to be understood as grounding. The typical unmasking gesture in Marx's critique is therefore inversion, turning consciousness around from its head onto its feet. Feet here means knowledge of one's place in the production process and in the class structure. That consciousness must be considered unmasked, that does not want to know about its social being, its function in the whole, and therefore persists in its mystification, its idealistic split. In this sense, Marxist critique deals successively with the mystifications of religion, aesthetics, justice, welfare, morality, philosophy, and science. Besides the critique of mystified consciousnesses, Marx's theory harbours a second, far-reaching variant of ideology critique, which has shaped the critical style of Marxism, its polemical sharpness, the theory of the character mask. As a theory of masks, it distinguishes a priori between persons as individuals and as bearers of class functions. In doing so, it remains a little unclear which side is respectively the mask of the other. The individual, the mask of the function, or the function, the mask of individuality. The majority of critics have, for good reasons, chosen the anti-humanist version, the conception that individuality is the mask of the function. Thus, there may well exist humane capitalists, as the history of bourgeois philanthropy proves, against whom Marxist critics have vehemently polemicised. They are humane merely as individual masks of social inhumanity. According to their social being, they regain, in spite of this, personifications of the profit interest, character masks of capital. Indeed, in some respects they are, for the agitators, worse than the worst exploiters, because they nourish the labourer's patriarchal mystification. Bourgeois role theory provides the mirror image of this theory by conceiving social functions, roles, as masks with which individuality covers itself in order, at best, to even play with them. Of course, workers' consciousness is also initially mystified. Its education under the principles of the ruling ideologies allows no other possibility. At the same time, it finds itself at the beginning stages of realism, because it performs immediate labour. With realistic instinct, it suspects the swindle going on in the heads of those at the top. It stands on bare ground. For this reason, Marx, here remarkably optimistic, believes that workers' consciousness is capable of an extraordinary learning process, in whose course the proletariat acquires a sober view of its social position and political power, and then sets this consciousness into revolutionary practice of whatever kind. In the transposition, consciousness gains a new quality. Here, proletarian enlightenment makes the leap from a theoretical to a practical change. It abandons the privacy of false or true mere thoughts in order to organise itself publicly as a new, true class consciousness. True because it understands its vital interests and aggressively works its way out of exploitation and repression. Enlightenment would reach completion practically as the dissolution of class society. Here, the fundamentally ambiguous character of Marx's theory is revealed. On the one hand, it reifies every consciousness into a function of the social process. On the other, it wants to make possible the liberation of consciousness from mystification. If one understands Marxism as a theory of liberation, one emphasizes the emancipative formation of proletarian consciousness and that of its allies. This view leads into the open, into the formative subjectivity of the allegedly last oppressed class. If this class liberates itself from its stifling position, it creates the precondition for the real emancipation from the exploitation of labour of everyone. The self-liberation of the slave in an ideal dialectic should lead to the liberation of the master from the constrictions of being master. Those who want to see Marx as a humanist emphasise this aspect. At its centre is the anthropology of labour. Labourers would gain their selves only when they enjoy the products on which they have expended their energy, and no longer have to relinquish the surplus value to the rulers. In this thought model, emancipation appears as the self-appropriation of the productive subjects in their products. In this thought model, emancipation appears as the self-appropriation of the productive subjects in their products. Of course, one would like to know what idealism really is if this is not thought out idealistically. From a second perspective, an anti-humanist, realist strand emerges from Marx's critique. Its emphasis is not on the dialectic of liberation, but rather on the mechanisms of universal mystification. If every consciousness is precisely as false as corresponds to its position in the process of production and domination, it necessarily remains captive to its own falsity, as long as the process is taking place. And that the process is in full motion is constantly emphasized by Marxism. Here the hidden functionalism in Marxism theory goes into effect. For this functionalism, there is, to the present day, no sharper formulation than the famous phrase, necessarily false consciousness. From this viewpoint, false consciousness is reified into its place in the system of objective delusions. False being is a function of the process. Here, Marxist system cynicism comes very close to that of bourgeois functionalists, but there is a reversal of the premises. For bourgeois functionalists regard the functioning of social systems of action as guaranteed only when certain fundamental norms, attitudes and goals are accepted and obeyed in blind identification by the members of the systems. It is in the interest of the system itself that these identifications are conceived of flexibly, and indeed sometimes even revised, by individual deviants, so that the system does not, by being too rigid, lose its ability to adapt to new situations. To this extent, a certain degree of irony and a niche for the revolutionarily inclined actually would be indispensable for every developing system. Naturally, functionalism not only denies human consciousness its right to emancipation, it also denies the meaning of such emancipation from norms and compulsions. For emancipation leads, according to functionalism, directly into nothingness, into an empty individualism, an amorphous chaos, and a loss of structure in society. That there is a grain of truth in this is demonstrated in the most drastic possible way by the socialist social orders in the Eastern Bloc. They provide the functionalist proof in a social laboratory that an ordered social existence is conceivable only under the constraints of functional, purposeful lies. In the cultural politics and ethical drilling of labour and militarism in socialist countries, the functional cynicism of Marx's theory of ideology is displayed in a horrifyingly clear way. In those societies, the idea of freedom is an existential, self-reflective enlightenment. In those societies, the idea of freedom in an existential, self-reflective enlightenment vegetates on a barbaric level. It is no wonder that the emancipative resistance, which somewhat unhappily calls itself dissidence, manifests itself as religious opposition. In socialism, that individual block to reflection, which the conservatives and neoconservatives in the West have long dreamed about, is practiced officially. Socialist countries put the drilling of values into practice with breathtaking radicalness. The element of minimal deviation, in the meantime, is also officially planned, ever since jeans have been made in people's factories and jazz has been played in Dresden. Viewed structurally, the party dictatorship in the East constitute the paradise of Western conservatism. The great conservative Arnold Gehlen did not admire the Soviet Union for nothing, a fact that can be compared with Adolf Hitler's full, but hidden, respect for the apparatus of the Catholic Church. Marxist functionalism remains remarkably blind to its own artfulness. In a modernization of deception, it uses the elements of truth in socialist doctrine as a new ideological bonding agent. The modernization of the art of lying is based on schizoid finesse. One lies by telling the truth. One practices a split in consciousness until it seems normal that socialism, previously a language of hope, becomes an ideological wall behind which hopes and future prospects disappear. Only in Marx's ideology critique can the trace of later cynical finesse be discovered in its beginnings. If ideology really meant necessarily false consciousness, and, no irony intended, there was nothing other than the right mystifications in the right head, then it has to be asked how the critic can claim to have escaped the vicious cycle of deceptions. By going over to the side of the deceivers. Question mark. By going over to the side of the deceivers? Dialectical critique sees itself as the only light in the darkness of true falsities. However, in this, dialectical critique demands more of a fruitful thought than it can provide. The discovery of labour and the logic of production, despite the fundamental importance, do not provide a master key to all questions about existence, consciousness, truth, and knowledge. For this reason, bourgeois counter-critique, for the most part, had an easy game with Marxism in its weakest point, the crude level of its theory of science and knowledge.